welcome to this installment of our Made at the Library event today. This is an event presented by the Rare Book Division in collaboration with the Manuscript Division. The Made at the Library series highlights works that emerge from research conducted at the Library of Congress. We are so grateful to welcome John Bidwell and thank him for joining us today for this talk about his recent book, The Declaration in Print and Script, and the research process that led to it. Dr. Bidwell is a curator emeritus at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. He received his bachelor's degree in history at Columbia University, earned his MA at Columbia's School of Library Services, and achieved his doctorate in English from Oxford. John has written and taught extensively on graphic arts and the history of printmaking and papermaking. Dr. Bidwell will begin today's event with a presentation to introduce his book's focus on 19th century printings of the Declaration of Independence. Then he will join Dr. Stephanie Stillo, Chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, in a conversation-style interview. With the time remaining in the hour, you'll have the opportunity to ask your questions. As you enter the room, I hope you notice the display of a few printings of the Declaration and other relevant items from the library's collections. You'll have another opportunity to see those materials after the conclusion of the program. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Bidwell to the podium.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Come to think of it, I've had all sorts of things made in the library. I've come here now and then for personal research projects, as well as my exhibition work at the Morgan Library. The LC Exhibitions Registrar saved my bacon in 2018 when I had to borrow manuscripts and photographs for a Whitman exhibition after the application deadline. You came to my rescue again in 2020 when I started on this Declarations project in the midst of the pandemic. Somehow, I had to look at 60 prints and broadsides. Stephanie, here are my reasons. A lot can be learned by looking at the Declaration in quantity. Americans began to cherish it in the 19th century more than a text, an iconic object, a precious relic they could read and revere. Artists, printers, and publishers gave them what they wanted: engravings, lithographs, and letterpress broadsides adorned with patriotic emblems intended to evoke the moral values in the living presence of the Founding Fathers. This urge to embellish the text reached a peak during the centennial. I've been studying how that style developed and why it fell out of fashion. To that end, I've examined about 200 publications, a sample large enough to track changes in taste and trends in the trade. The Philadelphia newspaper publisher John Binns was the first to sell the Declaration as a work of art. In March and June 1816, he issued subscription proposals for a large pictorial engraving costing $10 plain, $13 colored. It would contain a calligraphic text, facsimile signatures, portraits of Washington, Jefferson, and Hancock, allegories of victory and prosperity, and a symbolic border of state seals he called a cordon of honor. By the end of the year, his proposals appeared in 80 newspapers throughout the United States. His saturation advertising played a part in alerting Americans to the historical importance and emotional impact of the document. He claimed to have spared no expense to evoke its meaning and achievements. His print was so ambitious, so rich in detail, portraits, emblems, and ornament, that he hired 5 artists to deal with different portions of the design. Some artists fell behind. Others quit and had to be replaced. Delayed but undaunted, Binns distributed proofs to newspapers and obtained glowing reviews to entice the public and prove that the project was still underway. But other printmakers poached the customers he had been prepping and flooded the market with cheap imitations before he could finish his magnum opus. A journeyman employed by one of his engravers stole his concept and produced a smaller version for sale for around $4, a budget price eventually reduced to 50 cents. The writing master Benjamin Owen Tyler also succeeded in underselling Binns before the $10 print could be completed. Binns accused him of plagiarizing his prospectus. Tyler fought back by impugning the honesty, patriotism, and politics of his opponent. Newspapers took sides all the better to publicize the competing prints. Binns's enemies detected a political bias in his choice of portraits, John Adams conspicuous by his absence, a deliberate affront to Federalists. In contrast, the rival print let the text speak for itself in an elegant round hand interspersed with ornamental scripts. If neutral in its politics, it was an outright commercial venture and a means of self-promotion. Tyler used it to display his skills in lettering and advertise a course in penmanship he was teaching in Washington, D.C. The writing master launched a subscription campaign for his declaration, beginning with big names like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, and Henry Clay. There they are on the first page of his subscription book, followed by lesser names of customers he recruited on his sales trips from Richmond, Virginia to Bangor, Maine. He swung by Nashville, Tennessee to sell a copy to Andrew Jackson. He claimed to have sold 3,000 copies. He embarked on other printmaking projects in hopes of getting his piece of the political pie, a handout, a patronage commission, or an appointment. He published inspirational letters of Jefferson and Jackson, sycophantic portraits of John Adams and Henry Clay, and a campaign poster for the Whig ticket in the 1840 election. These ingratiating print ventures were ignored. Clay denied him a job in his department. Adams rebuffed him. Abandoned by friends and family, beset by debts and drink, he died indigent in a New York City almshouse in 1858. Likewise, Binns failed to profit from the Declaration despite repeated attempts to sell it to people in power. To prime the pump, he gave copies to both houses of Congress with the understanding that they would be displayed prominently as if to inspire the lawmakers' deliberations. What became of the Senate's copy, I do not know, but the House's copy still survives in its magnificent frame and in its designated place. That I can say on the authority of Samuel F.B. Morse's painting of the chamber, where you can see it near the Speaker's rostrum. After the House moved to larger quarters, the space became the National Statuary Hall. You can still see the print amidst the statues. John Quincy Adams detested Binns. An infamous man, a radical as obnoxious as the print he had designed. Adams could not forgive the omission of his father's portrait and the subsequent dispute that tainted a precious document with political invective. The newspaper announcement that Binns was giving copies to Congress must have seemed at best a publicity stunt, at worst a ploy for patronage. A few days later, Adams asked Tyler to make an exact replica of the document, a scrupulously accurate surrogate of the original. Even then, the original was in poor condition, which went from bad to worse when Binns's engraver damaged the signatures. Something had to be done to stop that man and ensure the future of the document. Then, serving as Secretary of State, Adams took it upon himself to make an official facsimile sponsored by his department and approved by Congress. Tyler was too expensive, so he hired William J. Stone, an expert engraver who spent 3 years striving for the utmost accuracy in the rendition of the text and signatures. The State Department requisitioned 200 copies printed on vellum for publication on July 4th, 1823. You can just barely see the date and Adams's name in the unobtrusive imprint on the top. Compare that to Binns's credentials and Tyler's affidavit, both certified with official signatures and Tyler's with a departmental seal. Both were more impressive than the State Department imprint. With these assurances, devotees of the Declaration did not demand the more accurate reproduction, which was not available even if they had wanted it. Congress drew up a distribution list limited to government offices and office holders, along with the living signers and Lafayette. The State Department facsimile was government property, a limited edition not available to members of the trade. Printmakers looked elsewhere for the signatures and found them in the certified authentic Binns and Tyler engravings. Facsimile signatures derived from those two engravings appear in more than 90 prints during the 19th century. Letterpress printers copied the decorative schemes in Binns's and Tyler's engravings. Like Binns, these printers framed the text in a symbolic border with patriotic attributes. Like Tyler, they emulated and embellished the handwriting of the original. Letterpress broadsides were cheaper than intaglio engravings. This one was a freebie, distributed at an Independence Day parade in 1828. Members of the Baltimore Typographical Association printed it on a press they had installed on a float, a vehicle festooned with muslin and decorated with paintings of statesmen and military heroes. Apprentice boys played the part of Mercury, the patron deity of the printing profession. Dressed in flesh-colored tights, the Mercuries each held a caduceus, a pole by which they conveyed the freshly printed broadsides to the spectators. This broadside was priced at 12.5 cents. The printers used stock cuts to replicate Binns's state seals, cordon of honor, and display types to imitate Tyler's calligraphic lettering. Tyler charged $5 for his engraving. Letterpress mass production technologies brought the price down to $0.125, a price easily within the means of most Americans. I hope I've made it clear how these cheap imitations help to popularize the Declaration and keep it in the public eye. They might be tacked to a wall or passed from hand to hand. The more ambitious prints were framed for display in homes and public places. Picture framers stocked them for sale to walk-in customers who might buy them on a patriotic impulse. In one form or another, the decorated text was everywhere. The decorative impulse could be taken to an extreme by introducing gimmicks and graphic novelties. A doctor by profession, R. Morris Swander developed a sideline and trompe-l'oeil calligraphic portraits drawn with a steel pen and printed by lithography. Swander learned how to modulate the thicks and thins of letters in ways that would depict Washington and Lincoln within the texts of the Declaration and the Emancipation Proclamation. Up close, you could read the documents word for word. But at a distance, they took on different meanings. They personified, they embodied the father and the savior of the country. Others copied Swander's work and augmented it with motifs derived from other prints. You can see how Declaration publishers stole images and ideas from one another in a race to the bottom. I will show you one more example to summarize what I'm trying to say about the rise and fall of this patriotic art form. Hands down, the Centennial Memorial was the most ingenious, least expensive, and best publicized mass market product in the Declaration business. It was printed and reprinted so many times with so many variations in price, size, and layout that I can't account for all the commutations and permutations. The credit for this merchandising triumph goes to the printmaker James D. McBride. Planning well in advance, McBride persuaded the Secretary of Interior to sign an authentication statement in January 1874. The statement implies that he had replicated the original, but that, of course, was no longer possible. So he copied the State Department facsimile instead. He formed two dummy corporations, one in Philadelphia, the other in New York. Both companies offered his facsimile in two sizes, a regular edition and a larger premium version. Both put a price on the premium version. But here's the catch. If you bought it in Philadelphia, you paid $1. But if you rode off to New York, you paid half that price. I believe that McBride devised that pricing strategy to exploit the excitement of the centennial, confident he could overcharge tourists who bought souvenirs on the spot. To my mind, he personifies the hucksterism of the Declaration business. But that's not all. He sold advertising space in the regular edition to merchants who used it as a promotional giveaway. I've seen variant issues of that edition carrying advertisements for clothing, hosiery, housewares, hardware, cabinetry, fertilizer, woolens, curtains, carpets, medicines, newspapers, liquor, railway travel, and fire insurance. A wide variety of goods and services provided by firms based in 14 cities on the eastern seaboard and as far west as St. Louis and Detroit. So there you have my attempt to suggest the size of the Declaration business. It started with expensive engravings and crested during the centennial with lithographs priced next to nothing. I haven't told you about other printing technologies such as stereotyping, which made it possible to reprint thousands of copies. I only touched on Declaration imagery in books and pamphlets, also published in huge editions. But I hope that you can see how that text became a mass market commodity and an art object firmly ensconced in American visual culture. Thank you.
Okay. All right. We are on. We're going to give John a second to sit down. But again, thanking him for being here. John is not a stranger to most of us in this room, which is lovely. When I was saying hello to people, they were saying, I wouldn't miss a talk with John Bidwell, which is quite lovely. So I want to start out, John, with a little bit of a conversation that I think speaks to the purpose of the Made at the Library series, right? The Manuscripts Division really created this series as a way to talk about how people do research, right? Particularly how people do research at this institution, but certainly at other institutions as well. So, one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is that you mention right off the bat that this started in 1988, that you first published on this, which I think is like this beautiful reminder, right? That research takes time and is often very iterative. So tell us about your research journey with this book that has spanned a few decades now. So tell us about that.
Well, it was a journey. Can you hear me? Is this okay? It was a journey. That 1988 article was the results of a lecture I gave at the American Antiquarian Society. It's the sort of thing where I was invited to do a lecture, pick a topic, so I picked that, and you need to produce in 7 months. So the lecture was duly published with a checklist, and I think there were 45 items in the checklist. Ever since, I've seen in antiquarian booksellers' catalogs blurbs for declarations they've dug up, and they say, "Not in Bidwell," with a price. And so, Stephanie, I did plenty of other things between 1988
I do hope so.
and 2019. But in the back of my mind, when I was approaching retirement, I was thinking, all right, this is my opportunity to go back and do it right, or at least to do the best I could. In fact, the Library of Congress was not represented the first time around, with mea culpa.
You heard it here.
And there are other collections that I needed to visit and revisit. So to some degree, the book is an act of contrition for the article. And I hope the article will be forgotten in years to come. So I've spent my professional career as a curator, working mostly with graphic arts. And I'll just say, maybe I'm doing the research from the wrong direction, but the way that I've done things is to look as much material as I possibly can, let it talk to me, and then see if there's a story to be told. Look at the material first and see if there are patterns to be detected. And that's how the Library of Congress really played such an important part in this. Because I suddenly realized that these print publishers were going crazy in, as I just said, plagiarizing each other, copying each other, concealed reprints. And so you really have to look at this material carefully and really look at the details. And so the opportunity to come to the Library of Congress, and thank goodness to do cell phone photographs. Boy, in my business, that is sort of revolutionized. I am so grateful to Elsie to do that. By the time I was done with this project, I had 1,800 photos so I could compare and find editions, issues, and states and try to figure out how these things were reprinted and who was copying whom. And then I am super grateful to the Library of Congress, which has done a great job in digitizing its prints, super high resolution, free download on the web. That was great. So you could really look at the tiny details. That's a long answer to your question.
It was a great answer to my question, and it actually launches me into my next one. I love this idea of using these sources to sort of tell those stories, right? We like to say in the rare book division, because we're all trained very well by Mark Domination, that we are storytellers, right? And we love to think about the way that documents tell stories, right? So this leads me into my next question, which is, what does this sort of declaration business, in your opinion, tell us about this particular moment in American history? You talk about this moment of living in the memory of the Revolution, of the Centennial. What did this sort of draw? What stories did that sort of draw out for you?
Well, again, I think this speaks to what the Library of Congress does and what it has achieved. To me, again, looking at the declaration business, I detect a kind of anxiety in Americans about their history. And here you are in 1816, and history already seems to be slipping away. And you can see a number of the broadsides with a note at the bottom saying the equivalent OMG. The last 3 living signers are Adams, Jefferson, and Carroll. I showed you the one about the Baltimore parade. That was in honor of Charles Carroll, 1828, the last living signer. And so he physically represented American history. And there he was in a cabriolet, I think is the word, or some kind of a coach, going down the parade route to the end of the route to lay the first stone of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So you can see the kind of civic pride of having the last living signer ensure the prosperity of your city. Okay? I didn't even mention a whole other current in declarations. This is another long answer to your question. But
I love long
okay,
answers.
okay,
It means I
excuse
could
me for
just
this.
sit here and listen to you, John.
While Binns was actually selling his $10 print, John Trumbull was busy marketing his painting, The Declaration of Independence.
Such a fascinating story you told about that.
I think it's an amazing story. So, as you can see in the Capitol Rotunda, that painting was a sensation. And Trumbull put it on tour in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Baltimore. He estimated that 32,000 people had come to see it. But more importantly for him, he estimated he made $4,000 in admissions fees, and he needed the money. Just kind of a patrician type, you know, you had to keep up appearances in the Trumbull family. He was always living beyond his means. He needed the money desperately. So, when you went to the exhibition, you were given a key to the painting, so you could identify all the figures in the painting. And on the verso of this piece of paper were proposals for a print version of the painting. And this is how he was going to make his money. Because if you subscribed for the print, you had to pay $10 down, $10 on delivery. That was a ton of money. And he was thinking, well, this is going to restore my fortunes. The print is magnificent. It really is one of the great achievements in American graphic arts. The engraver was Asher Durand, age 24, just at the beginning of an amazing artistic career. That print commission, I think, made the career of Durand. But it wouldn't sell because it was too expensive. And there are letters from Trumbull to his Federalist friends saying, "How is it, my dear sir, that this print, Gothic at best," that's what he said, Gothic at best, engraved by an immigrant Irishman, sells so well when I can't sell my print, which in due modesty, I think will do credit to the American graphic arts in the eyes of the world. So again, you can see this kind of current about history. How do you record history? The interesting thing about the Trumbull print is that Jefferson dictated to him the layout and sort of the background. And Jefferson was wrong. Jefferson was wrong. And so you go to the Rotunda and you take a look at the painting, And the painting says July 4th, 1776. But actually, it's June 28th. Jefferson had forgotten that Congress had signed the Declaration on a different day than it was published, July 4th, and the day that he had presented his rough draft to the President of Congress, which is June 28. And so there's a ton of newspaper controversy. Somebody called the print a mongrel print, mixing truth and fiction, a mongrel print. And that's an example of what I'm trying to say about the anxiety. If even the founding fathers get it wrong, how can we do this? So, if we do authenticated declarations with authentication statements by the Secretary of the Interior, this is absolutely accurate. This is a piece of history you can hold on to. That's what I'm trying to say.
This is such a good point, because this was one of the things that I really wanted to bring up to you, because one of the things that really came out in your book for me was this idea of this like almost obsession with authenticity, right? Like there is, and I'm so glad you brought up like the mongrel painting, or this kind of obsession that the signatures and the facsimiles were exactly right, or that those could be authenticated in some way. And I was really wanting your opinion about what that sort of underlining current of needing that authenticity was about. And it sounds like you're saying that it's kind of rooted in this anxiety of the moment. Does that sound right?
Absolutely, and maybe I'm biased, having been a curator of printed books during my professional career, but this is actually a situation where the text gets more credit than the image.
Yeah.
And so people were buying the Binns print and the Tyler print. Well, they were cheaper, but also they had all these certificates of authenticity and stuff like that. And they had read in the newspaper that things were going wrong in Trumbull's painting. Yeah. So maybe the image was not so trustworthy.
So I want to keep us on time, because I don't want to take all the time with questions, but I am going to linger for just a little bit longer with you here, John. So, you know, I really like what you're saying of that, and acknowledging that this moment in American history is really defined, you know, in sort of historiography largely by, you know, textual analysis. It's a very cultural history defined by these big names, right, in American history. But this is also this amazing moment in the evolution of print technology, which is something that you kind of mentioned as well, and in advertising too. And so I wonder if you could speak just a little bit more about sort of the coalescence of those things coming together in the 19th century at that moment.
Well, I think this is fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's great when you start with Binns in 1816 to follow the technological progression to the end of the century. And you start with these expensive engravings. And max, you could print maybe 3,000 copies before a copper plate gets worn. But then there are these other technologies. Steel engraving, I didn't even mention steel engraving. And a lot of these declarations proudly announce engraved on steel. So unlike the Trumbull plate, where you could get good first impressions, and then there were sort of the lousy impressions. Take a look, I hate to say this, at the Yale University Art Gallery website, where their copy is a late impression, and it looks terrible. It looks so washed out, because a copper plate suffers so much during the printing process. But with steel engraving, it's almost infinite what you can print. And so here you're having a mid-century technological development that revolutionizes the declaration business. One of my favorites are sort of combination of the Trumbull with the text, steel engraved. And steel engraving brought the price down. that people were being sent copies of these for free as promotional giveaways if you subscribed to a magazine. You know, it's like a promo. If you took an annual subscription, you'd get a free Declaration print. Steel engraving made that possible. Okay, that's just one example. Lithography. Penmanship is so important. That's why Benson Tyler started with engravings. But that means an engraver has to interpret your script. If you go to lithography, then you can go directly on the stone, and it's more trustworthy. And you can do larger editions. I didn't even mention stereotyping, that 12.5-cent plate that I showed you was stereotyped. And so that plate was copied and sold to printers in New York who did thousands of other copies of that.
I think that one of the things that's so great about this book is that I think that you can certainly read it as this, this book certainly about this 19th century moment, about American history, but you could assign this as kind of a history of 19th century print as well, and how sort of that changes. I think that it's really interesting to think about how Ben sort of started out in some ways a traditional model, right? Like he has this subscription, it's gonna be this, very expensive engraving, it's gonna, which is a really traditional model. And then you have this technology that kind of catches up with this moment, and you just have this incredible explosion, like you're talking about, like stereotyping and all of that. I mean, it really kind of floats this story in a really interesting way.
That's a great word, explosion. And particularly in the centennial, because you've got the technology now and also the market.
Yes.
And so there are declarations all over the place. If I may say one more word in praise of Library of Congress.
As many words as you want, John.
It's Centennial Central. Because I think the print publishers at the time realized that they needed to try to protect their rights to their prints. And the best way was to deposit it for copyright at the Library of Congress. The result is that the Library of Congress has more of the Centennial era prints than anybody else. And furthermore, many of these prints are the only copies I've been able to find. The only one. And I think, Mark Dimination can testify about this. It's kind of a law in the rare books world that the cheaper and the larger edition on something in the 19th century, the less likely it is to survive. Yeah. And it's the cheap, huge editions that survive in one copy. And that's what I'm seeing in the Library of Congress holdings of these Centennial era declarations.
That's absolutely fantastic. And it's also one of those wonderful things that, you being a curator, you being so involved in the book world, it just really made this book quite magical for me, especially of being in the rare book world and having someone that has your perspective like that, being able to sort of comment on this moment, I think was really great. So I'm going to probably steal a question from many of you that you will have for John, but it will be my last one, and then I will hand it over to you guys. But when Julie and Patrick and I were coming together and we were talking about this, we all came up with our different questions of what do we want to ask John about this book. And the thing that just glared out for all of us was the declaration market. We were so fascinated by that. And you really did, you touched on it already the idea of what did people do with these? They're sort of, again, there's this explosion, they're all over the place, they're absolutely, fascinating looking. Like, what were people doing with them?
Such a good question. And you caught me. Because in a way, we curators are a lot better about production and distribution than we are about reception. And it's something that time and time again we need to discipline ourselves and really think about how these objects were used. That's why you see people now suddenly interested in annotated books, for example, because that's an evidence of reception. So this was a challenge for me about the declarations, was to try to find how the customer base used these. And I had a little bit of success, interestingly, in travel narratives. People who went through the United States in the 1840s and 1850s, went home and published an account of my travels. And two of them said, you could go to any country in the United States and see a framed declaration on the wall. I thought that was pretty good. I've seen a couple of inventories where a declaration would actually be listed among the object of the recently deceased. Well, that's low-yield research, so I didn't do much of that. What else? There were some people who criticized each other's declarations. And if you're attacking your competition, you might say how it was used and how mine is used. And so that was kind of useful evidence. The Library of Congress has the only copy known to me of a Benjamin Owen Tyler pamphlet advertising his. It's in the Rare Book Division. It's a terrific item. And in this pamphlet, Tyler says the head of the family should get it framed, put it on the wall, summon the children in front of it, and tell the children, this is what's made you free. Well, that's an interesting family scene.
No doubt. All right, John, thank you so much. I think it's time that we hand it over to the audience for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my microphone and let you guys ask your questions. And I think we have some folks to help out with that.
So, John, what happens as you move into a more modern era, say out of the 19th century? Does the interest in this flag, do the world wars pick up? Does the whole, how does it go? What happens moving forward in time?
Excellent question, Sandra. What I should have said is when you get to the end of the century, people just get sick and tired of the allegorical, emblematic, ornamental declaration. And you see more and more a demand for the unadorned State Department facsimile. So suddenly you see lithographic firms in the business of making facsimiles of that facsimile. And that's sort of why I chose 1900 as a stopping point, because the decorated version falls out of fashion.
And to follow up, I imagine that a lot more different nationalities now are emigrating to the U.S. who maybe don't have that kind of historical sense that, well, my ancestors were here in the 16 or 1700s or even the 1800s, but as the waves of the later immigrants, maybe not such an important item to put on your wall.
Well, that's also an interesting question. Again, after 1900, for example, you see the government printing office in the business of making cheap declarations, which could have been used for civics instruction. I've seen GPO catalogs where it's at 25 cents. Some of them were clearly intended to be displayed on a schoolroom wall, so they could be rolled up on a spindle, for example. So that's a possibility.
Hi. I apologize, I arrived late. I don't think you covered this because Stephanie asked a wonderful question when I was here, but I wonder if you could say just a little more about the idea of the Declaration print as a souvenir, going along with the idea of authenticity and nostalgia. And just for a little background, so as we go into the 20th century, I know, I work in the main reading room, and I know my colleagues here in Rare Books experience this too. Probably not a week goes by when someone doesn't write in and say that they have an old copy of the Declaration, and can we help them figure out what it is? So especially in the 20th century, you can buy these in National Park Service gift shops and all kinds of places. But going back to the time period you were most talking about, I was struck hearing you talk about, so you start to see people taking pieces of Plymouth Rock home with them, or Mount Vernon. And at some point, they sold pieces of the beams in Independence Hall in the late 19th century when they redid that. So there's that authenticity thing, but also printed souvenirs like decorative ceramics and handkerchiefs, and there's a lot for Lafayette, for example. I've been doing some work on William Penn, and there's this John Trumbull print of William Penn signing the peace treaty that makes its way to England and gets twisted around and comes back over in these unusual looking Staffordshire plates where William Penn is in India signing a treaty. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts on the bigger context or the idea of a souvenir, a thing you can hold on to as part of the interest.
The souvenir business is fascinating. And you're right about the people coming to the reading room and saying, well, I've got an original Declaration. And by the way, I get a lot of incoming mail about that. And I always try to be helpful and encouraging. And I tell you, 1 out of 10 will have a good Declaration in some way, So it's worth the effort. As to the souvenir business, yeah, that's why I sort of mentioned that it gets kind of relic status. The best example I can think of was an autograph collector. Well, I can think of 2 examples, actually. An autograph collector who had his facsimile framed in wood from Independence Hall. I mean, that really is like a medieval relic. The other is the head librarian of Boston Public, who was an autograph collector. And perhaps you've heard about people who collect the signers. To this day, autograph collectors try to get complete sets of the signers. This is one of the great challenges. And you probably get people in the reading room who have a signature of this or that founding father. Well, this librarian at Boston Public made the ultimate facsimile by getting a copy of the State Department facsimile, but cutting out real signatures and pasting the real signatures over the signatures in the State Department facsimile. And you can see this in Boston Public, and it looks pretty good, you know. You can see the difference in paper tone, you know, because, you know, they're snipped signatures, but that might give you an idea of this souvenir obsession.
What I find most interesting about this topic is it really drives home the point of the fluidity of our history and how we arrive at a canonical telling of our history. I grew up, believe it or not, in a household where we had a portrait of Hubert Humphrey and John F. Kennedy in our hallway. Something I'm sure doesn't happen anymore in America, but it spoke to that kind of iconography and the story that we were being told when we were growing up. And it makes your talk today reminds me that when Jefferson sold his library, Adams' response was, "I envy you this immortality, for at least you will be remembered." And speaking to that nervousness of what has been, 50 years later, Adams was, I think this happened at the viewing of the painting, not that line, but Adams was upset at the viewing of the painting because he was afraid they wouldn't be remembered for the Declaration, or that he wouldn't be remembered. And I'm wondering if in this process you've gained some understanding of how we move from certain events or objects being pulled from sort of a moment in history and emerging as the iconography of an established event. We tell our history with the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the such and such. And it seems like this is so much, that fluidity is so much a part of what you're talking about.
Mark, I think you are right on about the fluidity and maybe the interchangeability of images. And one of the things that has intrigued me, vexed me, is why the Declaration becomes sort of the iconic text and not the Constitution. We see sort of "we the people," but that's it. You don't see the Constitution printed with emblematic motifs. You don't see the Constitution made suitable for framing. Part of me makes me think it's sort of a graphic arts situation in that the Declaration, after the congressional revisions, was just the right size for a letterpress broadside. It fit perfectly on the standard sheet of paper in 1776. And so that sort of ensured this kind of graphic arts immortality. And then the Constitution, as important as it is and as resonant as it became, never became a graphic arts object. And so in that vein of history, the Constitution was ignored. And again, I think it's fascinating. Could it just be an artist's layout decision? Forget the Constitution?
Okay, so I think that we are going to stay on time, so we are going to have to close it, but John will be around, so I want to thank Patrick Hastings and Julie Miller for helping us put all of this together, and let us definitely thank John for his wonderful insights today.